There's many people in Russia and in China now who are talking about geopolitics and how the earth and landscapes and geography can affect politics, how the politics of a country and the political system and the economy of a country can reflect the way the land is set up. And generally, those who refer to geopolitics divide the history of the world between land civilizations and sea civilizations. And the idea is that in parts of the world where there's a lot of ocean access, you tend to have more individualist economies, and you tend to have more centralization of wealth, and you have empires that focus on controlling the trade routes. Whereas on land masses, in particular in Eurasia, in Russia, in China, in Iran, and places that are on the Eurasian world island, you tend to have civilizations that are more collectivist in nature and focus on development. And that this relates to the fact that in order to have expansion on the Eurasian mainland, you need to build roads, you have to build infrastructure, whereas in order to dominate the ocean, you just simply need control of trade routes. And so there's a whole lot written about the empires of the sea in the ancient world versus empires of the land, right? And the term used for empires of the sea, they call them thalassocracy. And empires of the land, the term that is used is turgocracy. And the understanding is the ancient Chinese empire was an empire of the land. It was a turgocracy. The Russian Empire was a turgocracy, whereas the British Empire of the 1800s and the Roman Empire, these were empires of the sea, and they were thalassocracies. Ancient Greece was a thalassocracy, right? And that these are two types of civilizations that can exist. And this is kind of a vague historical analysis. Alexander Dugin promotes this kind of thinking. It's very popular in Russia. They talk about Eurasianism or Eurasianist thought. There's also a lot of Chinese academics that are promoting it, and it's been around for quite some time, arguing that the peoples of the East and the land-based civilizations have a different culture than the peoples of the sea. And if you look at the history of the Russian Revolution, many people argue that there was a shift in communism from sea communism to land communism with the rise of Stalin and the defeat of Trotsky. And it kind of started with Lenin. So Karl Marx did most of his writing in Britain. He lived in Britain, which was at that point the capital of the British Empire. And Karl Marx, his writing, he said, "Workers of the world unite." And he was focused on the idea that capitalism was an advance over feudalism, feudalism was an advance over slavery. And the way Marx saw it, capitalism was going to spread all over the entire world, and then that would eventually lead to a socialist revolution all over the whole world, and that would eventually lead to communism in the world. And so Marx defended free trade. Nowadays, Marxists and socialists generally go around opposing free trade because free trade allows banks and corporations to destroy economies, etc. But back in Marx's day, Marx was defending free trade because he said free trade will open up commerce, it'll create one world economy, and it'll lead to a situation where capitalism spreads all over the whole world, and then eventually you'll have a global working class that'll be united and have socialism. And it was Lenin who came along, and Lenin, keep in mind, is not in Britain, he's in Russia. And Lenin says, well, actually, we're for nationalism of oppressed nations, and we're struggling against imperialism. We're not against just plain old capitalism. We're against imperialism, which is the British Empire, right? Banks, trusts, cartels, and syndicates holding back development. And we're supporting the fight of entire nations to break free from imperialism, from this international financial system. So the beginning, you could argue, of Marxism and socialism shifting from a sea-oriented orientation to a land-oriented orientation begins with Lenin. And of course, Lenin forms the party of new type, the Bolshevik Party. And the Bolshevik Party is like a clandestine secret organization, and it's very demanding and disciplined. It's not a debating society like he considered the other groups to be. You're expected to give the whole of your life. People said that the Bolshevik Party was almost like more of a monastic order. They compared it to like the Franciscans or the Jesuits, where you were expected to give the whole of your life to the revolution, right? An organization of professional revolutionaries. And people said that has roots in Russia's history with the Decembrists and the Old Believers, and that in Russia there's a long tradition of these kind of secret societies and organizations that are dedicated to changing society. And that with Lenin, you have the beginning of Marxism kind of leaving the Western sea civilization mentality of Karl Marx and drifting into the land civilization camp. But then you have the rise of Stalin, and Stalin opposes Trotsky. And what is the big disagreement between Stalin and Trotsky? Trotsky says he's for permanent revolution, which is spread communism all over the entire world. And Stalin says, I'm for socialism in one country, meaning that we can organize our economy to have socialism, we can raise our people out of poverty, and sure, we'll support revolutionary movements in other countries, but that's not the focus. The revolution in other countries is not our business necessarily. We just want to focus on raising our own people up out of poverty, organizing our society this way. Stalin says they need to have 5-year economic plans to industrialize the country. Trotsky says that he wants to draft everyone into the military and militarize the economy and use the military to then spread communism into Europe to have global permanent revolution. And we all know that Trotsky lost and Stalin won over Trotsky, so Trotsky fled first to Turkey and then to France and then to Mexico. And he formed his own organization, the Fourth International, he called it, or the Trotskyites. The Trotskyites were against the Soviet Union. They invoked Lenin and communist history, but they said they were against Stalin. They said Stalin he led what they called a parasitical bureaucracy, and so they were opposing Stalin, and they were calling for a political revolution to overthrow the Soviet government. Eventually, as we saw in the film last night, a number of leaders of the Soviet government were arrested for allegedly being in a conspiracy with Trotsky and getting funding and support from the Nazis to try and overthrow Stalin. Trotsky was found guilty in absentia in the Soviet Union for being the leader of this conspiracy. And then in Mexico City, he was killed. Somebody came into his home and ice-picked him in the head, and he was killed. And that was, as World War II was breaking out, he was killed. And so Trotsky and Stalin kind of represented, I would argue, the land versus the sea division in communism. Whereas Stalin was a guy from the countryside. He was Country Joe. He was from a small village in Georgia. He'd gone to seminary school to learn to be a priest. And in priest school, he had been kind of a rebellious student. He dropped out of seminary school and eventually joined the Bolsheviks. He was a union organizer. He was the editor of Pravda, which was the daily agitational newspaper that they distributed. Trotsky, on the other hand, spent most of his life in exile. He was from Ukraine, but he lived most of his life in Paris and Berlin and Vienna. And he was this well-known revolutionary intellectual who was known at the time of the Russian Revolution. He was living in New York City, where he had a newspaper called, if there's any Russian speakers here, I'm going to butcher this, Novy Mir, which means new peace or new world. And he had a newspaper for Russian-speaking folks in New York City. And when the Russian Revolution happened, he went back to Russia, and he joined the Bolsheviks. Lenin and Trotsky had vehemently disagreed with each other. They had very big disagreements. However, he saw the Bolsheviks were going to win, and so he joined the Bolsheviks in July of 1917, and the Bolsheviks took power in October of 1917. And Trotsky had his theory of permanent revolution, which Lenin had always rejected. And the main disagreement was that Lenin called for a revolutionary dictatorship of the workers and the peasants, meaning that they were going to have the working class was a small minority in the country, just the people in the cities, but the bulk of the Russian population were peasants. And so they were going to build a revolutionary government of workers and peasants. Trotsky said peasants are an inherently backward class because they were working farms that are owned by nobles. They aspire to own their own farms. They aspire to become capitalists. They seek to become capitalists. They have a reactionary aspiration, so they're an inherently backward class. So any government, any revolutionary government that came into existence couldn't include the peasantry because they were inherently backward. Well, you couldn't have had a revolution in Russia if it hadn't included the peasantry, because they were the overwhelming majority of the population. But Trotsky had grown up in Ukraine, and he had been a victim of anti-Semitism at the hands of a lot of Russian peasants, and he had the belief that the Russian peasantry was inherently reactionary. And that was the primary disagreement between him and Lenin. Lenin wanted to organize the peasantry and want an alliance with the working class, and Trotsky said the peasants are inherently backward and reactionary. And because Russia had a peasant majority, Trotsky said the only place that it would really count to have a communist revolution was the Western countries. So if Russia had a revolution, it would just be a temporary holdout to spread communism to where it really mattered, the West, where they don't have peasants anymore. Right? That was the idea, because peasants were inherently backward. Another thing that Lenin and Trotsky disagreed about was that Trotsky was going around calling for the creation of the United States of Europe, the European Union. He was going around saying that if we brought all the European countries into one country, that would break down national barriers and the workers would come together and they'd have a revolution. And Lenin said, we don't want that. We don't want all the Western imperialist countries to come together, because then as they combine their strength, they can more effectively colonize and exploit the third world. So we don't want to create a United States of Europe. In fact, we want the Western imperialist countries to be divided, because that can open the door for colonized countries to get their freedom. So that was a big source of disagreement between the two of them. And then Trotsky announced, on the verge of the Russian Revolution breaking out, he announced that, oh, he repented or whatever, he supported Lenin, he joined the Bolsheviks, but then after Lenin's death, he starts talking about the permanent revolution again, and of course he has a falling out and a disagreement with Stalin, and he forms the Trotskyite movement, which is the other communists, right? It was a way that one could be a communist, but against the Soviet Union, against the socialist countries, in the name of permanent revolution, in the name of being ultra-revolutionary, you would oppose the actual communist governments. And that was the disagreement. And it was really, in essence, a lot about land versus sea, but also about the East versus the West. Trotsky was holding on to Western Marxism, and Lenin and later Stalin had taken Marxism in an Eastern direction, and there was a clear divide. And when we think of the revolutionary movement in Europe, we think of the middle class. We think of, if you ever see Les Miserables, right? Those guys in the pubs, do you hear the people sing, and waving the red flags, and the intellectual students who want freedom and want to rebel and tear the world down. That's the ideology of the Western revolutionary middle class intelligentsia. And that was Trotsky. That's what he was about. But if you look at Stalin, Stalin's a guy from the countryside who went to seminary school. And there's almost a conservatism about Stalin. Stalin is trying to build a movement of people that are patriotic and loyal to their country and want to use socialist methods to build their country up. And there's a disagreement. And this is the Stalin-Trotsky divide. And it's important to understand this divide because it's rather key in understanding where PSL and Sam Marcy came from. So Sam Marcy, his birth name was Sam Balin, and he was born in Ukraine, I believe in like 1912, 1911, something like that. And he was born in a Jewish village. And in Tsarist Russia, Jews were segregated. They lived in different villages. They were segregated. And during the Russian Revolution, the White Army was known to terrorize Jewish villages, and the Red Army protected his village from the White Army. And so his earliest memories of childhood was the Red Army, which he called our army, protecting the village. And he remembered when he was a child how he saw those Red Army soldiers come and protect the village, how happy his family was to be protected. His father was already living in New York City at the time, but he and his brothers were with their mother and they lived in Ukraine. A few years later, he came to New York City, but his earliest memories were of the Red Army protecting his village.